Good morning, or I should say Erev Tov in Israel, where our speakers are joining us from. I am Laura Cutler, the Managing Director of the Center for Israel Studies at American University. And on behalf of my colleague, Professor Michael Brenner, the Director of the Center, we'd like to welcome you to today's discussion with some of Israel's leading journalists about a topic that everyone is anxious to hear about. I want to particularly thank our co-sponsor for this event, the School of Communication, who did a wonderful job in publicizing this event, which is relevant to their students as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Professor Guy Ziv. He is one of our most popular professors of Israel Studies courses. His courses always have a wait list. He teaches on U.S. foreign policy, international negotiations, U.S.-Israel relations, and Israel-Palestinian peacemaking. He is the recipient of the SIS Outstanding Teacher Award a couple times in 2014 and the William Cromwell Award for Outstanding Teaching in 2019. He is also the author of Why Hawks Become Doves, Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change in Israel. And you may see him more often as he appears regularly as a commentator in major media outlets like BBC, CNN, I-24 News, etc. So without further ado, Guy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Laura. And I want to thank Laura Cutler and Professor Michael Brenner for organizing this wonderful event today. I want to introduce briefly the speakers. David Horovitz is the founding editor of the Times of Israel. He was previously editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and prior to that, the Jerusalem Report. He's the author of several books, including Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, and A Little Too Close to God, The Thrills and Panic of a Life in Israel, as well as a biography of Yitzhak Rabin, Shalom Friend. He's the recipient of the 2005 JDC Award for Journalism on Israel and Diaspora Affairs, the 1995 B'nai B'rith Award for Journalism, and the 2014 B'nai B'rith's Lifetime Achievement Journalism Award. Yaakov Katz is editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and author of Shadow Strike: Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power. He is also the co-author of Weapon Wizards: How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower and Israel versus Iran, the Shadow War. Prior to taking up the role of editor-in-chief, Yaakov served for 2 years as a senior policy advisor to Israel's Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. In 2013, he was one of 12 international fellows to spend a year at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Noa Landau is a Haaretz journalist and a member of the newspaper's editorial board. She's the founder of Haaretz 21, a new organizational project aimed at amplifying underrepresented voices and stories of Arab communities in Israel. Prior to this, she served as a reporter, head of the news department, and editor of Haaretz's English edition. Before joining Haaretz in 2009, Noa worked as a journalist for Galei Tzahal, Channel 10 and Maariv. She's also an advisory board member and alumni of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Thanks to all three of you for being here and to everybody else for joining us today. Last week, Israelis went to the polls for the 4th time in 2 years, and the result was yet again a stalemate. So I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists to give us your brief take on this latest election. What are the key conclusions that you wish to share with our audience today? And Noa, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm very happy that people are still interested. It's not easy to keep track, so it's wonderful that we have so many viewers today. Well, I think, first of all, that every time we have another round of elections, it actually becomes more interesting because the mystery of how they're supposed to actually assemble this coalition becomes much more complicated every time. This time specifically, of course, the biggest story is Arab representatives. They're now being represented by two parties, not one, not just the joint list, but also Ra'am, which makes it very difficult for both sides now to assemble this coalition. On one hand, you don't have really right and left in Israel anymore, but you have the Netanyahu bloc and then the anti-Netanyahu bloc, which is also interesting and becomes sharper every time we have elections. And now both of them actually need the Arab representatives to form the coalition. And we see that Netanyahu, who is, of course, famous for all of his campaigns against forming a coalition with Arab parties, now actually needs one to form his coalition. I mean, in most scenarios, it's kind of like, I don't know if everyone knows the riddle about the sheep, the wolf, and the cabbage that need to cross the river with a boat, and they can't be at the same time on the same boat. So that's what our election results look like. This is a very complicated puzzle. So actually, Netanyahu now needs Ra'am, which is known to support a fraction of the Islamic movement in Israel. This is something that actually his voters are not so happy about. And of course, some of his more prominent partners for the expected coalition, such as the Zionist Religious Party, and of course, which has, of course, also Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a former Kahana supporter. So you have this very interesting situation where Netanyahu is supposed to assemble a coalition that includes Itamar Ben-Gvir, Kahana support on one hand, and on the other hand, the Islamic movement represented by Ra'am. Honestly, I don't know how this will happen. But also the other side is trying to assemble this anti-Netanyahu bloc that doesn't have a lot in common aside from that. So you have the right wing, the center, and the left trying to kind of participate in the same government. So this round is very mysterious. I think most analysts now think that we'll actually have a fifth round because it seems probably not likely that one of them will manage to gather the votes. But on the other hand, I mean, everything is possible. We saw so many things in the past 2 years that, it could actually happen.
Well, why don't we go to David? Do you agree with Noah's take that Ra'am and Ben-Gvir could be potential kingmakers? What are your conclusions?
Well, first of all, as Noah says, and as Noah indicated, we really don't know. I think probably the next 50 minutes or whatever of this webinar will be a lot of, well, really don't know. This is the fourth semi-deadlocked or deadlocked election in 2 years. I think all of us are wary of predicting anything, even things that we thought we knew, even things that we thought were reliable, have turned out not to be. There is no way on earth that Netanyahu partners with a conservative Islamic party. It's totally ridiculous. Well, except maybe it isn't. We thought that the exit polls at 10 p.m. when the polling stations close were at least, relatively reliable compared to the snap opinion polls leading up to the election. But all three of the TV exit polls failed to predict. Well, this is based on, thousands of people coming out of the ballot boxes, out of the polling stations, and then supposedly placing an identical envelope in the exit pollsters, or actually they had a tablet system, but making the same vote. And yet all three of these supposedly ultra sophisticated exit polls failed to predict that Ra'am would get any seats at all. So even some of the most basic things, it turns out we don't know. And I think that the mark of all of this is, numbers are supposed to be immutable, right? There's 120 Knesset members, there's 13 parties, do the arithmetic, okay? But we're quite smart people. There are lots of very smart people trying to commentate. There are lots of very smart people trying to work their way out of this deadlock, whose most personal, political, and ideological issues are at stake. And there's no clear direction here. It is not clear whether Netanyahu will somehow be able to muster a coalition, whether Mansour Abbas of Ram, who is unknowable. We do not know what this man will do. Will he go with Netanyahu? We are assured by people within that community, it's unthinkable. It's political suicide for him to align with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu, moreover, who would need to be supported by the ex-Kahanists or the maybe still Kahanists of Otzma Yehudit, as mentioned by Noah, and by a little faction called Noam, which is viciously anti-LGBT. By the way, just to complicate the picture even further before we even get going, Mansour Abbas's party is not terribly well disposed towards the LGBT community either. Anyway, the bottom line is everything that we would like to think that we can tell you clearly, we can't. You had an election that more than any other of the last three, I would say, this fourth one was the most clear and pure referendum on Netanyahu. And I say that because Avigdor Lieberman, an ex-Netanyahu partner, worker, before he even went into politics, he had already switched to the anti-Netanyahu camp. But in this election, two other parties from Netanyahu's own part of the spectrum, ideologically aligned parties, Yamina and New Hope of Gideon Sa'ar, challenged Netanyahu. So the opposition to Netanyahu, the parties saying flat out or intimating that they wanted to oust him, now extended not just from the left to the center, but deep into the right. And yet Netanyahu is not finished. Had the Arab turnout been as high as it was in the election a year ago, when the Arab parties won 15 seats, this time they won only 10, then maybe Netanyahu would be finished. He might still be finished. But in terms of where this goes now, we know that Rivlin got the election results today. We know that in a few days he'll start consulting with party leaders. We don't even know for sure who those party leaders will recommend. We don't know who Rivlin will recommend as prime minister. So, a week after the elections, many more questions remain open than you would have thought would be the case.
So more questions than answers at this point. Yaakov, what do you think? What are your key takeaways from this last election?
Well, just to follow up on what David said, my 14-year-old daughter asked me today, she said, Abba, Dad, who won the election? We're a week later. And I said, I still don't have an answer. But I do want to point out two different things, just following up on what both Noah and David said. There's a famous Talmudic phrase called, Mashalo lishma ba lishma. What is not for the sake of heaven can turn into the sake of heaven. And that's one of the big stories of this election, right, is how Netanyahu, in reaching across the lines to the Arab parties, has nothing to do with the motivation of I want to improve the Arab quality of life. I want to better integrate Israel's 20% minority. That was nothing to do with the story, right? All it was, can I find a way? And that was throughout the campaign when he went to all these vaccination centers in the Arab sector, when he spoke about how he would give a slot on his party list, and he ended up giving somewhere in the high 30s to an Israeli Arab. It was all because of how can I get votes, and it's still unclear, but maybe he got 1 to 2 seats at the most in the Arab sector. But it was, what came of this though, is that for the first time in Israeli history, 73 years, we're actually talking about, in a legitimate way, the integration and active participation of Arab members of Knesset, of Arab parties in an Israeli governing coalition. That is a great thing. That's an important thing. That's a good thing for the state of Israel, right? So I think that in the long term, we will, as a country, benefit from this situation if it actually pans out. But important to keep in mind where it actually came from. It didn't necessarily come from that for the sake of heaven place. The other thing that I think is really to frame the election results is important to keep in mind. You have over 70 members of Knesset, right, in this Knesset, maybe even probably close to 75, who are members of the right-wing camp, right? They belong to Israel's right. Their ideology is right-wing. They believe in, to a large extent, in the greater land of Israel. They are mostly of those people opposed to a two-state solution, or to maybe a watered-down two-state solution is what they would support. They're very conservative in their approach to matters of religion and state. They would want to retain the status quo as the way it is now and continue to give the ultra-Orthodox parties the monopoly and the chief rabbinate the monopoly over all matters of religion and state in Israel. They are in favor of significant reforms to Israel's judicial system. That's over 70 people. And despite that, Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot put together a coalition, because what connects Israeli parliamentarians today, or Israeli political parties, is not ideology, right? It's not some big idea. It's not some vision for what I want the state of Israel to look like in a year or 5 years, 10 years, but it's about a single individual. It's about personality. You know, in America, they talk a lot about identity politics. Yes, we have that here too, but here we've taken it maybe even a little further. We talk about personality politics, right? So is it yes, Bibi, no, Bibi, right? Are you with Netanyahu or are you against Netanyahu? And I think that that's the tragedy of Israel today, right? Is that we have someone, a leader who's actually very qualified, right? As the leader of a country, has a lot of success in many different initiatives that he's done, a lot of failures, corruption, allegations. There's, trust me, lots of trouble. But on the other hand, and he has these 70 plus people who could potentially imagine, Guy, what these 70 plus members of Knesset could do to Israel. They could change Israel for decades to come if they had their way, if they're able to coalesce into a coalition. What they could do to the way we select our Supreme Court judges, what they could do to the dynamic and the relationship and the checks and balances and the separation of powers that we have in Israel. They could do a lot of reforms. And when it comes to the Palestinians, if they wanted to annex parts of the West Bank, they have a lot of potential, but they can't get their act together. For them, that's a miss, that's a tragedy, right? But they can't figure out a way to move beyond this personality political situation that they find themselves in. And I think that that's crystallized after this fourth election.
And this is something, a sense that I get from, you know, commentators on the left and the right and the center, that if it were not for Netanyahu, the right wing would be, you know, able to form a coalition without a problem. So next Monday, President Rivlin is set to begin consultations with leaders of each of the parties. And I want to ask you, who do you think is going to tap first to form a coalition? Or are we, as I think at least one or two of you suggested, heading towards a fifth election? So walk us through what you think is the most likely scenario or likely scenarios that we can expect beginning next week. Who wants to take that on first?
I'm fine too.
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
I'll try and be brief, and then everyone can weigh in, of course. I just want to have one other thing that we didn't mention yet, and it's really relevant. We're speaking to America. We're in an Israel that feels itself, rightly or wrongly, to be post-COVID now to some extent. The country's opened up. The worst traffic jams on Chol HaMoed Pesach in the history of traffic jams of Israel. You go outside in Israel, the restaurants are open, the people are on the beaches, the roads are packed. And the person who got us all vaccinated, I don't think his worst critics would deny that Netanyahu's obsessive, as the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, put it, obsessive pursuit of vaccines. He called me 30 times, Bourla said in an interview just before the election, which you would have thought would have helped Netanyahu, despite vaccinating the country and keeping us alive, if you want to take it to an extreme. He didn't win this election outright. So that's just something else to bear in mind. And it's just such a stark difference in Israel between life here and so much of the rest of the world. Netanyahu is so central to it, and yet, in terms of Rivlin, he doesn't know who he's gonna charge. So it's nice that you think we can answer, but we can't, because he doesn't know yet exactly who will be recommended by which parties. He doesn't know. He has some leeway here, and there's a big row today because he encouraged the politicians to build unusual collaborations or coalitions that were sort of out of the box. And this was taken in Likud as some devious effort by Netanyahu rival Rivlin to find a way to oust him. But the fact is he has leeway, and the precedent in Israel is that the president chooses as his candidate or as the person he gives the first try to form a government, the person he thinks has the best chance of forming the government. It may be that Netanyahu gets the most recommenders, and that Rivlin might have a reason to think that still Netanyahu doesn't have the best chance, or the opposite. It's not clear how many people will recommend Lapid. It's not clear how many people will recommend Bennett. Bennett is a pivotal figure here. He won 7 seats. He's extremely hardline. And there's a row in the anti-Netanyahu camp about whether, how much support to give Bennett now. Can Bennett be relied upon if they recommend him to not go off and do something with Netanyahu? After all, Bennett is the one Zionist party leader who hasn't committed to one camp or the other, the pro or anti. And therefore, it's not that we're trying to analyze what Rivlin may or may not do. It's that Rivlin at the moment doesn't have the tools to have reached that decision himself.
Noah,
Maybe I'll
Yaakov?
just, yeah, I mean, I agree with David to a large extent, but I think that and we can't really predict what will happen, but I think that if people come to the president and the person who gets the most recommendations ends up being Netanyahu, I think it'll be very hard for Rivlin not to tap Netanyahu and give him the mandate, right? Yes, he does have leeway, and apparently, according to the law, he can really give it to who he deems personally to be the person with the greatest chance. So even if Netanyahu gets the most recommendations, if he feels in off-record conversations with leaders of the parties that someone else, let's say Bennett, could put together a government, he could potentially do that. But I also think that it'd be difficult for me to see him ignore the fact that you do have one party leader who has received 30 seats, about 1 million votes in this last election. And that is Netanyahu. He's nearly double what the party is after him, Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, who got 17. So if Netanyahu does get the most recommendations, I think that for the first round of attempts, he will likely have to give it to Netanyahu. If Lapid can get more recommendations, right, which would be dependent on Gideon Sa'ar joining, who Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope party has yet to say that it would recommend Lapid, that could change the calculation. But to give it to Bennett, to me, seems really just far-fetched. But anything's possible in Israeli politics.
No, what do you think is the most likely scenario? And I saw that earlier today, there were some attacks on Rivlin by some Likud operatives. And I want to get your take on that too.
So I agree with Yaakov. I think that it's true that the president does have leeway, but in the end, it's traditionally almost automatic that he goes with the person with most recommendations, because it's very hard to explain a different situation. And as you mentioned, he's been attacked today by the right wing, and specifically ministers from Likud who see any kind of hint, and I don't think it was a hint. I mean, Rivlin said, like David mentioned, that basically he thinks that there needs to be creative solutions and combinations because, well, this is just a fact. There's no other way to form a government if there are no creative partnerships on both sides. It's not, it's not true only to one kind of government. So he just stated a fact, but in Likud, they use that to kind of launch a campaign that I think they were getting ready for this campaign even before Rivlin actually said that, to kind of delegitimize his decision in case it wouldn't be Netanyahu, kind of leaning on the personal grudge that the two, Rivlin and Netanyahu, have for a long time. Yes, he's really, they're looking for him and they're looking for every word. And I think Rivlin, because he knows that and he wants the results to be legitimate and for the widest crowd possible, then I don't think he will take any chances. I mean, again, we don't really know, and everything's possible, and journalists are very bad prophets, but I think that usually, traditionally, it's almost automatic that he goes with the person with most recommendations.
Thank you. So next Monday also happens to be the day that Netanyahu's trial for his alleged corruption and breach of trust is set to resume. And I'd like to get a better sense of how you feel this current political reality will affect his trial, and what are the chances of Netanyahu getting some sort of an immunity deal from these corruption charges. One of our students, Joshua Anthony, has a similar question. Is there a chance that they're going to pass, the anti-Bibi camp will pass this kind of law, in which case, Netanyahu will be immune from prosecution? What do you think? Noah, do you want to start with that?
Well, again, hard to say, everything possible, but I mean, if Netanyahu had a way to pass these laws, he would have so far, and he didn't. And I'm not sure that current possibilities to form government help him so much with that. I also personally think, and again, it's hard to say, but I'll take a guess and say that I think Netanyahu himself would prefer to see his trial being postponed and prolonged, to see this process, take many years, more than just cancel his own trial, because I think for Netanyahu, in the end, he still sees himself as liberal, in the sense of classic liberal sense. He sees himself as part of the Western liberal tradition, and I don't think he wants to see himself as one of those leaders who actually cancel their own trial with all the everything it will mean internationally. So I personally don't really see that kind of a law, but there are discussions now in Israel about the possibility that Netanyahu might be, as a solution to this mess, be nominated to be president. This is a very interesting situation because for some reason people think that it's more important to see Netanyahu leave the prime minister office, but then it's okay for him to be indicted but president. I personally think it's a weird solution, but it is something that Israelis are talking about.
Wow. Okay. So Yaakov or David, what do you think? Yeah.
I mean, I agree with Noah. It'd be very funny if we just made him president of Israel. But I also think that, Knesset members know how to be cynical and also know how to be cruel at times. The vote for the president is voted by 120 members of Knesset. It's not a vote by the Israeli public. It's what do they call it? Like a private personal vote, right? So it's behind a curtain. It's not like a regular vote in the plenum that you see how people vote. So people could really, even his own Likud members who have had enough of him, could vote against him. And that would be a real embarrassment for Netanyahu. I would wonder if he'd be willing to take that gamble, but he might, if he feels that that's the only way out. The trial is extremely interesting, right? The fact that it's starting now during coalition talks. What Netanyahu has done very successfully throughout the last 2 years and these 4 election campaigns is completely desensitized the Israeli public and the electorate from the fact that their prime minister is standing trial for severe corruption charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. It's a stain on Israel as a country, in my view, and on our, maybe on our democracy. We could say, no, it's actually a good thing that we're able to balance all this. I don't think so. I think that every decision that he's made over the last few years under indictment is tainted by his trials, and very difficult to disconnect political interests and survival interests from what decisions he makes, and not being the decisions for the benefit of the entire country. But that's a separate issue. But with regards to how the trial impacts all of this, I think that, yes, he would try to find a way to evade trial. I want to hope that Noah is right and that he deep down doesn't want to do it. But to me, it seems that is first and foremost what is his ambition, and his goal is to try to find a way to get out of this criminal mess that he finds himself in. There's a number of ways, right? One is to pass the so-called French law, right? Now, people will tell you, well, if he doesn't, what type of coalition? So if Bennett comes in, Bennett has said he wouldn't vote for it, but take a scenario for a moment that Bennett joins Netanyahu, and in exchange for joining Netanyahu, he's merged into Likud, right? And he becomes the number 2 guy in the Likud, and Netanyahu declares that he's the heir and the successor, the heir to the throne. In that type of scenario, Bennett's Yamina party would have to vote with Likud, right? So then if they would still need to get to 61 to pass the so-called French law, for whatever he might be paying out to Ra'am and Mansour Abbas, if he's able to pass and approve this coalition, those could be the extra hands that he would need for the 61 to pass the law that would get him out of his trial. And the second option was published in Haaretz, right, by a veteran Israeli journalist, Ravi Drucker, just I think it was a week ago, right, Noah, where he published an op-ed saying that Netanyahu could just fire the Attorney General, Mandelblit, and appoint a new one who says, I want to review the case, right? That's simple. Let's stop for a moment. And maybe that actually fits into what Noah said about prolonging the trial, but let's stop it for a moment. I want to review it again. I want to go through the files. I want to, talk to the police again. And that could just drag on for who knows how long, right? So he's got a couple of options still.
David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, would just add that it's a stretch to believe. I don't think it's impossible. I think Yaakov's right. But looking at the way the vote panned out, it's a real stretch for him to get a majority to pass legislation that would freeze his trial one way or another. I don't think it's impossible, but I think he would have wanted a very different result. Had the vote gone better for him, it was clear. Itamar Ben-Gvir, people in his own party were saying they would advance legislation. Of course, Netanyahu was saying he had no interest in it. But sadly, I don't think one can believe the promises and vows that Israeli politicians, most of them, make these days. So that wasn't given too much credibility. But I think it's a real stretch. And two other things about the presidency, I really don't see it. And again, we shouldn't predict anything. Netanyahu does not want to end his public life, forced from office into a largely symbolic post. He runs for election with an air of desperation, partly because of his legal issues, but also he's long since become self-persuaded that him leading Israel is essential to this country's very survival. He thinks nobody else can do the job. He thinks it's outrageous that all these pygmies are conspiring against him to try and force him out of office. I don't think he would. I think he would rather see his trial through to the bitterest of ends, and this is just my personal take, than to walk away humiliated, because that's what it would be, to take this state office and protect himself for this symbolic office and protect himself for a little longer. I really don't see it, and if I'm wrong, come back and tell me I was wrong.
And of course,
although if I could just add, David, that if Netanyahu is president, right, he won't be a president like any president we've ever
Right.
had.
I was just about to add that if the system would be presidential, then no problem, Netanyahu will take.
So we'd be looking and we would need a different parliament, I think, to be looking at that radical revolution. I think it's potentially there, but if you look at how the vote came in this time. And I'm happy, I think Yaakov's point about Bennett being folded into Likud, and therefore, okay, put aside the fact that Bennett is on record a million times saying he doesn't support retroactive legislation. So there is a way, to get past that because he becomes part of Likud. I just think, we've got reason to worry about our democracy. We do. We've had a prime minister who has battered away at the hierarchies of law enforcement for years. It's not good. It's not good for the credibility of the rule of law when the prime minister tells the country every other week at some times that the police are corrupt and the state prosecution is corrupt and they're all in league with the media and the opposition to fabricate charges and oust him. Not good. I'm not saying things are healthy, but I think some of these really dire scenarios, the key is not whether people would want them. The key is whether the political support is there. And even, as Yaakov said so rightly, when you look at the number of right-wing Knesset members, but are all these people who didn't leave Likud yet, or some of the ones who did, Gideon Saar's people, are they going to willingly lend a hand to the remaking of the separation of powers, not for necessary reform that could be argued, but tailored to the specific requirements of a prime minister on trial? I'm not sanguine about anything. I just think we're not there yet.
Nor do we know what Netanyahu has in mind, because there have been rumors that he will fire the attorney general, rumors that he, of course, vehemently denies. So we might return to this theme in a few minutes, but I want to move this conversation in a slightly different direction. Many observers of the U.S.-Israel relationship are curious about what this relationship is going to look like in the coming years. It would be hard to match the love fest we saw between Netanyahu and Trump. And so my question is, do you see Netanyahu or his successor working constructively with President Biden? And I want to note that there was a new Gallup poll that was just released a week or two ago, finding that 53% of Democrats, at this point, the majority of Democrats want to see more pressure being applied to Israel. And so I want to ask you whether you think that this invariably means that there are going to be future clashes between the Biden administration and whatever Israeli government emerges.
Yeah, we'll appoint Itamar Ben-Gvir foreign minister. That would be very good for Israel. And maybe I'll just quickly, yes, there will be clashes, right? And the reason there will be clashes is because this is sometimes difficult for American Jews to completely understand, and I sympathize. But Israeli politics is totally local, And they're thinking first and foremost about the coalition, about political survival. After that, we'll deal with what we need to deal with, right? Netanyahu also could be saying to himself, I'll form a coalition once I have a government up and running that's already been approved. I've passed the so-called French law. I fired the attorney general right within half a year. My trial has now been frozen. I'll give a call to my old friend Benny Gantz, right? And say, hey, Benny, why don't you come back in the government, right? It kind of sucks out there in the opposition desert, right? Where you're at the most, because you won't even be the opposition leader, you're at the most the chairman of the, education committee, right? If that much. And Benny Gantz, who was our alternate prime minister and defense minister and former chief of staff, something of a princeling of politicians, might come back and say, listen, why not? You got Biden, you got Iran, you got the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Israeli Arabs, there's a million excuses to come up with. So that's also a possibility. But I think there will be clashes. I think that we have a complete ideological divide between the Israeli right today and the Democratic Party in the United States. We don't see eye to eye neither on the Palestinian issue or on what's happening internally here in Israel domestically, and that's just the way it's going to be. But Netanyahu, by the way, can use that for his political benefit, right? He's done that in the past. You need a strong prime minister to stand up to a so-called, and I say in quotation marks, hostile prime president, right? He did that very effectively with Obama. He could do that again with Biden, right? So for Netanyahu, you just jump from crisis to crisis and you manage each one as they come along.
All right. So if you don't have anything to add, do either of you have anything to add to that about the U.S.'s relationship?
Yeah, I'm actually not that. I don't think we'll see that many clashes, actually. I think that first of all, the United States has much more important issues to deal with than our problem that feels like it's unsolvable. I think that Biden and Haaretz are, historically, Biden even called himself Zionist. They're not. This is not an Obama administration in terms of Biden and Harris personally, and I think that although we do know that there are different voices within the Democratic Party, I don't really see a major clash between the administration and the government, which we don't know which it is. I mean, Yaakov just said, gave us a scenario in which it's Netanyahu's government trying to deal with Biden's administration. But if it would be, I don't know, Lapid, for example, then the relationship could be great. So it really depends. But in either way, I don't think we will see the same kind of volume levels that we did with the Obama administration.
So no Biden Heights being built or established on the Golan. David?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything. I think Netanyahu certainly is fortunate that of all the people to whom the pendulum could have swung, it was Biden. I think that if it is a Netanyahu government, and it's a huge if, as we need to keep saying, there's no way of knowing, there will be friction over Iran, there will be friction over the Palestinians. They're not front burner issues for the US administration, but I think the friction will be less on both of those than it was in the Obama era. But we already see open disagreement where Iran is concerned, but it's being handled much more gently, and there's more consultation and so on. And of course, if it's I don't let's go with the if of a Lapid government, probably the relationship would be relatively harmonious. The principles that keep Israel and the United States as close allies pertain. There's mutual interests here as well as mutual values. But I think that's that's all I need to say. The key point there being, if it is Netanyahu who stays in, there are so many other people with whom there would have been a very, very, very different and very difficult relationship. Biden was his, if the pendulum was to swing, he would be very happy that it was Biden.
We're getting a bunch of questions, which is wonderful. So if you have a question, make sure to submit it in the Q&A feature of this Zoom session. And so I'm going to ask you whether or not, if there's, Larry Sidman asks, if there's going to be a fifth election, are people going to demand structural change? Are the Knesset members going to be changing, for example, the electoral threshold? Right now it's at 3.25%. Are they going to raise it? Are they going to lower it? This is kind of an evergreen conversation, right? I mean, this comes up repeatedly almost every time there's an election. Any thoughts here on Israel's stalemate, the political nightmare that emerges time and again, especially in the last couple of years?
It's a great question, but there's a problem. I mean, everyone's talking about changing the system, but who's going to change the system? Because we have a government that wasn't elected. So should they, call the shots and change the system in a way that will definitely benefit Netanyahu? This is also a problem that we can't solve, because maybe there needs to be some kind of a change, but who's going to make it?
So I'll just say, I don't know. I just think with a few little points, our system is the purest democracy. It's a wonderful thing. Every vote matters. And that, it's easy to say that the system's flawed. In fact, the system is plainly dysfunctional. But what should we switch to? An American system where most people's votes don't matter, where you can win the popular vote and lose the presidency, a British system where you can come second in 600 plus constituencies and not get a single seat in parliament, or the Israeli system, which, like I say, this pure democracy. And then, by the way, just imagine, because really smart people have come up with all kinds of planned reforms, a 50% proportional representation system and a 50% constituency system. Just imagine who appoints the committee to divide Israel up into its constituencies. You could engineer Israel's governments for decades to come, depending on where you draw the lines. And again, the point that Noah makes, it will require the people who've just been elected, many of them, to vote themselves out of foreseeable office. It will require their consent. It's hard to see it. Our system isn't working for us, that's for sure. Maybe raising the threshold. I don't know, Yaakov, if you think that's possible. They play with the threshold a little bit without too much of a fuss. So that's the most doable reform. I don't know if that's on the cards. I haven't heard anyone suggesting that that's going to be done. Even that would make a bit of a difference.
No, raising the threshold would be a great idea. The problem is also what both of you mentioned, is how do you pass that in the Knesset? The way to do it would be to get, right, because the small parties are obviously not going to vote to raise the threshold, because then they would be wiped out. So you would have to have cooperation of the large parties in the Knesset, right, who would be willing to do it. We actually had a government like that, right? We had this unity government that collapsed, right? Of what was it, 70 something seats, 35 and 30, whatever, right? More, that they should have, that's the kind of government that can do something like that. They could pass legislation that raises the threshold to 5%, to 6%, to 10%, whatever it is, right? And then you create a 2 or 3 or 4 party system. The Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox parties would merge. The Arab parties would become a bloc. You'd have a right-wing party, a left-wing party, Arabs, and ultra-Orthodox. Everyone else comes together. And then you could actually have some stability. The right-wing wins, they bring the ultra-Orthodox. The left-wing wins, they bring the Arabs. That's what Israel used to be once upon a time, right? I mean, in a different way, but with the big Mapai and then when Likud came along.
So I want to actually pick up on, you mentioned the Haredim, and we haven't really talked about them yet, but one of our students, Zach Rubiner, asks about the placement on the UTJ list. So United Torah Judaism, one of the Haredi parties, the Ashkenazi Haredi party. He says that he noticed that Moshe Gafni and Yaakov Litzman switched places on that list. This is a very insider baseball kind of question. So he wants to know whether or not this would have any impact on the UTJ list. And I would just add that we've seen in the last week an interesting potential split between the Degel HaTorah faction within the UTJ, which is more reluctant to recommend Netanyahu than the kind of more dominant stream. So I wanted to get your take on what's going on there in UTJ, and is there a potential shift among the ultra-Orthodox when it comes to coalition building in the weeks ahead?
Since you two guys are silent, I'll go first briefly. It really is inside baseball, which is not a bad thing. We're so far inside baseball here that our heads are exploding anyway. It's okay. So yeah, Gafni has done I think a long agreed rotation with Litzman, so he's heading the list, and he's been a little ambivalent. But I tend to think, don't take my word for this, we don't know. I tend to think that they will fall dutifully into line as long as it is credible that Netanyahu has a chance at building a government. I think the other side of that is maybe something we didn't touch upon, which is all the psychology of this. And Netanyahu has been silent for a week, and he's supposed to speak in about 15 minutes. We don't know what he's going to say. And when we've all ended this conversation, you and I and all of us will go to watch him.
Here's one thing he's going to say, David. I got you vaccines, right? That you can be sure he'll say.
The psychology of this is really important. If Netanyahu is apparently finished, then all bets are off. All the most loyal allies, supposedly, will no longer be reliable. His own Likud party, as Aryeh Deri of Shas said, you vote for Shas, you'll get Bibi for sure. You vote Likud, I can't be sure how that will pan out. So long as Netanyahu is credibly in this game, none of these slight wobblings are necessarily relevant. But if it becomes the sense that Netanyahu is finished, that the anti-Netanyahu coalition has built its majority, has got itself together, is on the point of, then interesting things could start to happen. We're not there yet. At the moment, if you look at how this has played out in the week, what you see is a great deal of bickering in the anti-Netanyahu camp and relative silence, not complete, in the pro-Netanyahu camp. It's the antis are trying to work out how to strategize this, where their egos and ambitions fit when set against their ostensible imperative to oust Netanyahu. The Netanyahu camp, relatively silent, doing lots of things behind the scenes, I'm sure. And the psychology of all of this, becomes significant as well, I think.
What's important also
we
just
have
to
a
keep in
question?
mind, sorry, what's important just to keep in mind about the ultra-Orthodox parties is that first of all, they weren't always in Netanyahu's pocket, right? Shas, for example, sat with Yitzhak Rabin back 92 to 95, right? They would go with who's in power, with the ruler, and they go because they get their money, right? And they take care of their sectarian interests. I think, like David, and this just for the timeline, my bet would be that, and you could hold me to it and call me someone who doesn't know what he's talking about in just a week, but I would bet that Shas and UTJ first round recommend Netanyahu. That's the base. That just goes with tradition. Where it would change is, remember, what happens is the president gives it to one person. That person fails, he has the opportunity to give it to another person. Or take it straight to the Knesset. He deposits it at the Knesset, and only then, if 61 members sign, and recommend a specific individual, can elections be averted. At that point, I think it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is, when it sits at the Knesset, that's the point that the ultra-Orthodox could start to play and shift sides, I think. So in the beginning, they'll stay loyal because they know that their constituents want them to be loyal. That's why Aryeh Deri, the head of Shas, immediately said, we support Netanyahu, right? UTJ, Litzman and Gafni sent out different messages. Gafni said, we're not in Netanyahu's pocket. Litzman said right away, we are going to go with Netanyahu. They probably will. But in those last few weeks, if we get there, that's where you could start to see different constellations and breaking up that ultra-Orthodox umbilical cord connection to the Likud.
Well, we've also seen a change in demographics over the years when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox sector, as well as the national religious Zionist sector as well. And so my colleague Krista Tuomi asks, will changing demographics in Israel have any effect on future Israeli elections? How do you see demographics influencing the course of Israeli politics in the coming years?
Well, I think it's already influencing Israeli politics, but all demographic indications are talking about more ultra-Orthodox, more Arabs. That's the large picture that experts are talking about. I don't know. I think in recent years there's actually also a trend amongst more secular right-wing population. Netanyahu actually has a slideshow that speaks specifically about, refers specifically to that question of demographics, which is kind of disturbing also. He has this slide that he shows in different forums of how actually the secular Jewish population has more children now. So that's kind of disturbing that he's walking around with that slideshow. But in any case, there's also that. I don't know, maybe in a few years there will be a question if the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs could form a government. Maybe, maybe all the rest would be a minority. But I think that what Yaakov said about the four main tribes of Israel is basically it. And whether, one of them will be bigger than the other. In the end, we're talking about four different societies within the Israeli society. And that's basically the game for years to come.
One of the secular right-wing parties, Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, is another kind of interesting party because it attracts mostly, I think, right-wing voters that traditionally were part of Netanyahu's coalition. And of course, one of Avigdor Lieberman's major themes is he will support almost any government at this point that excludes Netanyahu. And so Zachary Barkley, who's another one of our students, asked, what role does Lieberman have in a kind of a future right-wing bloc, either during or after the Netanyahu era?
Look, Lieberman has this base constituents of about 5 to 6 seats, which come from Russian-speaking Olim, right? The late 80s, early 90s, when about 1 million Jews or descendants of Jews from the former Soviet Union moved to Israel. That still very much is his base of voters. He has a solid 5 to 6 seats there. He was able to get 7 in this election. I think that had a lot to do with a very anti-ultra-Orthodox campaign that he ran, which brought him took away some votes from Meretz and Labor and also Blue and White. Everyone kind of benefited from that new split. But he is also the strongest willed politician, I think. When he says something, he usually stands by it, right? So when he says he won't join with Netanyahu, he's the one who denied Netanyahu a government after the first election in April 2019, right? Netanyahu was sure that he had Lieberman. He would have had a 61 plus government. Lieberman refused to join him and has refused to join ever since. He still is right wing though, right? Let's not forget, right? Lieberman is not a leftist. He has his own issues with the police, and he's in favor of judicial reforms. He's been under investigation and on trial, like a lot of these guys, unfortunately. But I think that he would join any coalition now to get rid of Netanyahu. He would maybe recalculate after that were to happen to try to shift back into a right-wing position or slot.
Alan Makovsky asks whether Likud's flirtation with Mansour Abbas has ended the taboo on coalitions with Arab parties for both left and right. So I think, Noah, you touched upon this briefly in your earlier remarks about how, for the first time, we're seeing Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel matter, that Israeli politicians are actually taking them seriously. So how does this impact the kind of future that they're going to have in coalition formation? And would they even serve in a cabinet, or would they just support one prime minister from outside, let's say a minority coalition, supporting that minority government from outside the coalition? Any thoughts?
Well, first of all, they're important to the political game, and also suddenly they're important to the Israeli media, which on a day-to-day basis, usually it's rare to hear Arab analysts on the main broadcast. Suddenly, someone needs to explain what is happening in the Arab society. So that's a good trend as well. But I think the answer to the question of, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, is yes and no. Because yes, now the taboo is being challenged, and it's good for both sides. Again, I'm not sure I want to say right and left, because this is not really about right and left, but about let's say, pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi blocks. But it is good for both sides. But on the other hand, no, because for Netanyahu, once this doesn't fit him, once this is not, what helps him form a government, then he could go back to his old ways, which is inciting against any political partnership with the Arab citizens and their representatives. For him, it's all question of cold interests. So, now he wants to promise Mansour Abbas everything, but you can ask the previous guy, Benny Gantz, what those promises were worth. So I think he could definitely change his mind. And I think for the center left, this is much of a deeper process that needs to take place. The Arab society is very disappointed about the fact that Gantz actually did not deliver his efforts and promises to build a coalition with them. And about your question, whether they'll be in the cabinet or not, I mean, there are all these different possibilities. Again, this is not new. During Rabin's second government, there was already a situation in which our parties supported the government, what they call from the outside. They weren't in the cabinet, but they supported the government from the outside. So yeah, all these options exist. But I think that Mansour Abbas himself knows that now he has these very good cards. And he's not going to just he's not going to be satisfied with without major budgets and roles.
Before we only have a couple of minutes left. Go ahead briefly.
I was just going to say, we don't know where it will end up, but in terms of the specific question, I think a taboo has already been broken in that it was actually unthinkable that Netanyahu and Likud would entertain the notion of a partnership with Iran. It was unthinkable to Netanyahu. Now, we don't know where it will all end up, but the fact is it's no longer unthinkable. His very close colleague in Likud, Tzachi Hanegbi, said, well, we have to think about it. So something changed already, however it plays out.
I'm going to ask you two questions culled from the audience here, and maybe we don't need to have all panelists respond to both questions, whichever one respond to, and both have to do with elections, future elections. So the first one is from Jacob Lewis, who is asking, how does the outcome of this election affect the upcoming presidential election in the Knesset? I think we talked a little bit earlier about Netanyahu being a potential candidate, but maybe you have other thoughts on what might happen in this presidential race this summer. And then Rinaldi Paul, another one of our students, is asking about the upcoming Palestinian elections this summer and whether or not that's going to have an impact on Israeli politics, maybe future Israeli elections, or the future of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. So two very big questions. Does anybody have a brief answer for one of them?
President, I think we mentioned the Netanyahu option. There are other candidates who would want the job, some from outside the Knesset, some from inside the Knesset. We'll see. It's not the most important race for the Israeli public. With regards to the Palestinians, it'll be very interesting. That'll be the point after that election, if they vote in new leadership, to see what the Biden administration might do, what our government might do, if there's a way to renew some sort of contact negotiations. Keep in mind, Guy, that for 2 years, 4 elections, the Palestinians, which traditionally were an issue in an election, never even came up once. So this could be their comeback, potentially.
Right. And that's a really good point. Noah?
I agree with Yaakov.
And David?
Just, we've had a relationship with the Palestinian Authority. There's been, lots of talk about security cooperation being suspended and renewed and so on. But there is a relationship and there is coordination. We don't know if the Palestinian election process will go ahead, but if it does, and people who are spectacularly hostile to Israel become more powerful, that does start to change our reality. So lots of ifs and buts, but the potential, the choice of the Israeli president, as Yaakov rightly said, not the biggest of deals necessarily. If the Palestinian leadership undergoes some radical change, that impacts every Israeli, and we've taken for granted that hasn't been the case, but it could change.
And as I was telling my students earlier today in class, we don't even know for sure if the Palestinian elections will be held. There's always a chance that Abbas will cancel those elections. We are out of time. It's 1 o'clock. I'm going to hand it back to Laura Cutler. She wants to just say some closing comments to wrap things up. But I do want to just take a second to thank all three of our panelists. You've been terrific. I learned a lot, and this has been great food for thought. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join us as well. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. I try to get to as many as I could. Laura?
Yes, we just want to thank you again on behalf of the Center for Israel Studies. We have no shortage of interesting topics regarding Israel, and this year a lot has focused and will continue to focus on Israeli politics, so we hope you join us in the future. David made a comment earlier that he was worried about Israeli democracy. I hope you'll be pleased to know that this coming spring, hopefully in person in 2022, we will have an all-day conference about issues surrounding Israeli democracy, touching on some of the questions people asked today about elections, about a constitution, about the state of different factions in society and basic laws. So thank you again for joining us. This webinar will be available to you online, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you to our speakers today.
Thank you.